Welcome everyone to the first series of our 2030 commitment for AIA Austin's COTE chapter. This is a webinar format, so if you have any questions, please write it in the question and the Q&A section, and we'll answer those at the end of the session. So this is the first of our four-part series. An introduction to the 2030 commitment, and then the following three sessions will be the second Thursday of the month. We'll have a sustainability action plans and goal setting session, introduction to the DDX workshop, as well as some other tools, and an embodied energy and mentor session in April. And as part of the larger COTE effort, please follow us on LinkedIn. We're getting that started and would love to have a good following as we start to put more content out. So first, I'll do an introduction that should be about 10 to 15 minutes. It's adapted from a larger presentation that AIA 2030 National puts on, and we can distribute that to you after this. That has the kind of more quotes and data points, but just to kind of give a quick introduction and then get to the meat of the presentation, which will be a firm roundtable, and get you some answers from folks who are actually participating in the 2030 commitment. So the 2030 commitment is a program that seeks to transform the practice of architecture in a way that is holistic, firm-wide, and project-based, and data-driven, and transforms it to work towards carbon neutral buildings and developments and major renovations. So today in 2021, we're at about an 80% reduction for a goal, and then that will progressively get higher until we get to 2030. So the Architecture 2030 published the 2030 Challenge in 2006. The AIA National established the 2030 commitment in 2009, and then about a year and a half ago at the National Convention, AIA passed a resolution on climate change, which kind of prioritizes climate action as a portion of the health, safety, and welfare issue. And we're looking to rapidly decarbonize the buildings and built environment. So I'm sure everyone's probably seen a data somewhat like this, that 30% of greenhouse gas emissions are from building operations. So architects have a large role in how we start to cut our carbon emissions worldwide. So for the 2030 commitment, here's a couple myths and facts, and we'll get into some of these a little bit more during the firm roundtable. So if anyone's concerned about it taking too much time, typically takes about 30 minutes to input data. The gathering could take a little bit longer depending on how your firm is kind of set up with where that data lives. But hopefully you have a system in place and that's easily found. Myth, it requires too many resources. The program is free, and there's a bunch of resources and links at the end of this that are available to support you. Myth number 3 is if y'all are concerned about poor performing projects, and that relates also to myth number 4, which is that everyone has to achieve the 2030 targets once they sign on. And So the data is anonymous, and making progress towards meeting the targets is more important than meeting the targets right away. It's about incremental steps and having the data to know, one, how far off you are and what kind of makes the most impact to get to a larger reduction in emissions. And then this last myth is the project must complete. There are targets that you can kind of set for the end of each phase to report, or you can report at the end of a project. While it's requested that you report at every kind of design phase, it's not necessary. You can kind of make it how you want. So the 5 steps are to sign the commitment letter, create a sustainability action plan, try to meet all the targets, report all your projects to the TDX, and then review and update your sustainability action plan. So the first is to sign the commitment. There's a template letter, and we'll post this link in the chat where you can find the template. You can either just edit that and sign it, or you can place it on your firm letterhead and upload that as well. So there's not a whole lot of work associated with that. Then it's creating a sustainability action plan, which we will get into more depth next month at our second session. Third is to try to design projects that meet the current reductions, which is an 80% PEUI reduction for whole buildings, and then 25 predicted lighting power density reduction for interior projects. Then number 4 is to report the projects. There's a deadline on March 31st to report your portfolio, and the goal is to kind of report everything that is in an active design phase during that reporting year. And we'll talk about kind of what that process is for these different firms that are here today and how they're kind of accomplishing that. And then step number 5 is to update your sustainable action plan every 3 years. So just some metrics. So before 2019, there were about 500-ish firms that are signed on. Now it's at about 700. And of all those firms, you'll see that kind of either really large firms and then medium-sized firms are submitting portfolios more often than kind of this medium-large to small firm. But this kind of shows you the difference between who's an active signatory and who's submitting. And just some kind of metrics on this. There are around 200, and this is data from 2019. So there's around 200 whole building projects that are predicted to be net zero. So there are buildings that are hitting our 2030 commitment goal. 15% meet the 70% reduction target, which would have been the 2010 goal. And then 25% are meeting the interior only reduction target. And then back in 2018, we're showing that that there's a project in all these different use types that met the 2030 target in 2019, which was at 70%. We're at 80% now. And just to kind of read this box and whiskers chart, we're seeing that projects that are energy modeled are more likely to have a PEUI reduction that is meeting that goal, that target, versus projects that are not modeled, which this is using basically baseline code data to estimate the reduction in PEUI. And while the argument for joining the commitment is that it's the right thing to do. There are also some commercial savings that you can use to talk to clients. So this is typical commercial savings for a building in New York City. Probably energy costs there are a little bit more expensive than down here in Texas, but you can see that there's a decent energy cost associated with trying to meet these targets, as well as a residential savings down in Mobile, Alabama, which probably has closer to our energy costs. So both commercial and residential savings can be found. And then a couple of resources of the Framework for Design Excellence. This was put out 2 years ago. You can find it by searching Framework for Design Excellence or going to the AIA National website. And then here are all the, well, there's probably more resources than this, but a good amount of resources that help you improve energy performance and meet those targets. And we'll send this out so that you'll have these links. And if you go on the AIA website as well, you can find these 2030 by the numbers reports for, I believe, the past 9 to 10 years that kind of give a summary of how architects are doing with the commitment. So we'll move on to the roundtable now. So let me get that up. So we have our panelists from different size firms, and I will let them introduce themselves. They'll do it much better than I can. So let's start with, let's do alphabetical and go with Beth first. No, you're muted.
Hi, I'm Beth Brandt. I am with DSGN. We're a small firm in Dallas, Texas. I am a senior architect and director of sustainability at the firm. And I joined DSGN in 2013, which is about the same time we also joined the AIA 2030 commitment. And we have been reporting, I think we only missed 1 year, so we've been reporting ever since, and we've reported over, I mean, being a small firm, we've reported 31 projects so far.
Great. Go on to Kate.
So thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Sector, and I'm the Design Performance Coordinator at Lake Plato Architects, which is about a medium-sized firm, we're in Austin and in San Antonio. We've been doing the 2030 commitment and reporting since 2010, and I'm not sure how many projects we've reported over the past 10 years, but we typically try to report every single one of our projects. So this year, we're looking at close to 100. So that's our goal, is to report them all, but we'll see how that goes. Depends on what phase they're in.
Last but not least, Russell.
Hi, my name is Russell Billstrom. I'm a senior associate and project architect in our Minneapolis office of Perkins & Will. I've been managing our AIA portfolio since 2011. We signed on at the very beginning in 2010. And we submit probably about 250 projects a year from all of our North American offices. And that's averages about 25 million square feet of built space every year. So it's a pretty large portfolio each submitting year.
Great. I guess I should also introduce myself. So I'm Josh Ledger, and I'm with McKinney York Architects here in Austin, Texas. And we just signed the commitment last year. So we're starting with all this stuff. And hopefully we'll get some more signatories from this series, and we can support each other and tell us all the good work we're doing together. We're in the process now of getting our portfolio ready to submit. Well, in 3 months we'll submit it, but we're looking to some projects. We probably won't do the whole office, but we'll have something in there. All right, so let's get started with some questions. So first, this was one that I'll pose to all of you, and we'll go in the same order that we did before there. So how did your firm get started with the 2030 commitment?
So, okay, so DSGN got a project in 2006 that was City of Dallas Prairie Creek Branch Library. And the city asked us to try to meet the 2030 challenge at the time. So that's how we kind of got into it. And we did meet the challenge. And then, you know, a couple of years later, signed on to the AIA 2030 commitment. When I first joined DSGN in 2013, one of my first jobs was to write the letter, to sign that, to write the sustainability action plan, and then start reporting. And that's kind of how we got into it. Been reporting almost every year since. We do try to report all of our local projects. We're a design firm. We do act as design architect for some clients in the Asia and don't know anything about the mechanical systems. So we don't report those, but we report everything else.
Okay.
Great. And so Heather Holdridge is our design performance director, and she still is the kind of pioneer of our 2030 reporting. And so she was the one who originally got us all involved in the 2030 challenge. And so signing on to the 2030 commitment, like Beth said, it was kind of a no-brainer for us too. It's once we were committed to that, we decided to fully commit to the commitment. And so we were really excited about having a tool set that actually clarified how you measure progress toward the 2030 goals, which is what really inspired us to sign on to this, because I think intuitively Lake Plato does a good job of connecting, to place and striving to have good performing buildings that make our, area better. But we really kind of hold on to that quote of you can't improve what you don't measure. And so the commitment is what really allowed us to have exactly what we were looking for when it came to adopting the commitment. And so it's a great way for us to really also measure just how we are doing compared to the national average too.
Yeah, I think that is one reason that we joined the commitment, was because it was about kind of seeing how our designs are performing and being able to have the DDX and kind of compare that to the national average is a big help of the program. So Russell, I know Perkins Will was kind of one of the first signatories. So do you know the story behind that?
Yeah, it started actually before the AIA 2030 commitment was developed. In our Minneapolis studio, we actually led the development of our local AIA chapter's climate change position back in 2004. And one of the peer reviewers was Ed Mazria, who people may know is associated with the Architecture 2030 Challenge. In this climate change position paper, talked about the idea of carbon neutrality by 2050, with kind of changing the energy efficiency tiers every 8 years. So actually Ed's group really liked that idea and later came out with their own version, which is their 2030 challenge in 2006, had more aggressive goals and tiers and included both on and off-site renewables. So there's some difference there with the AIA 2030 commitment. And then from there, we went to our Sustainable Design Initiative leaders and pitched the idea and eventually signed on to the Architecture 2030 Challenge. I think we were like the first international firm to pledge on to that. And then later on, when AIA created their commitment, we signed on to that right away as well. And for all the reasons that people have talked about, why we wanted to sign on, we understood the need to get better every year and have a goal, and to understand technology changes. So you kind of need to incrementally increase those efficiency values. And I love data, and if you don't have the data, you don't know if you're actually doing what you're saying you should be doing. So there's tons of reasons to do this.
So a good portion of kind of architecture community in Austin is small firms. So how does kind of DSGN go about reporting? How much time does it take? Because I know with small firms with a little bit less resources than some of the bigger guys are more worried about kind of the time commitment that this would take.
Sure, that makes sense. I would say when the first year, it took me more time because I was new to the firm and I also didn't know where everything was and I'm not sure where to look. So the first time it took me about 2 days to find all the information. But there was only 3 or 4, active local projects at the time. So it took a while to get it started, but now, I mean, we know where everything is. It's right next to the code analysis on the server. And so in the beginning of the year, kind of, 2019 or right now, we're looking at our active projects, updating that. And it's for last year, since we were in the shutdown, it only took like 4 hours and we were done.
So kind of how does that kind of work per project? Or does it not work? Is it more just it's a bulk thing?
It's just, I mean, the good news of being a small firm is you don't have that many, so it doesn't take that much time. I mean, maybe there's small firms with hundreds of projects, but for us, we have maybe a dozen or so. And so I would like to start doing it more on a quarterly basis where we are assigning the staff to update that on a quarterly basis. But right now we're just me and one other person, whoever expressed interest in the firm. We sit down, we write down the active projects and we do it together so that there's somebody else in the firm that's kind of learning how to do this.
Great. All right, so Russell, with Perkins and Will being one of the first signatories and kind of having your own internal kind of system set up, does that mean that every project sets those 2030 targets? And if so, how does that kind of affect how you go about designing?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, all of our projects, dependent upon kind of scale, really, really small projects or projects that only went through kind of concept design, we exclude those. So we do have some eligibility requirements that match up to kind of how AIA looks at, what projects you support and what projects you shouldn't necessarily. So we do, expect all of our projects to achieve the target. That doesn't mean that they do in the end, but you have to set a goal from the beginning in order to get there. What's interesting too, so yes, Perkins and Will is, a fairly large firm, but we have 20 different studios. And so like the Minneapolis studio, we have only 50 people. There are some studios that are even less than that. So we're a group of both small and really large firms kind of doing all the same things. So we kind of have all the same challenges that everyone has here on the call. But yeah, I mean, setting, we try to have charrettes from the very beginning and to set those performance goals, as well as, any other types of goals apart from just energy, talking about materials and water efficiency and resilience and other things. Some projects are a lot easier to achieve these goals. Healthcare projects have a totally different energy kind of breakdown, and we found that those projects are much harder to get to that those reduction levels. Whereas if you have a corporate office or K-12, those are a little easier to do in terms of just how they use their energy. So yeah, it definitely affects the design process. We need to set goals. We're actually starting to create a more design-friendly early energy modeling platform, so that in concept design, in schematic design, we have a more graphic way of seeing what the energy output might be versus having to use true like energy modeling software, just so that when we're doing that front end work, we might not have an energy modeling consultant on there, or MEP doesn't have that in their scope, or they're not on board yet, we have the ability to kind of test some of the our energy outputs early in that phase, and then eventually get to a more robust energy model. So that's a little bit of kind of our process, but it really depends upon the studio. The smaller studios, may not have a super rigorous process, whereas our larger might have, or it could be the opposite sometimes. So.
Okay, so so you have your kind of initial goal setting, and then at milestones, do you kind of look at that again and reassess, or is it always like, okay, we're this far off and we need to get there, or I guess how does that kind of work?
Yeah, so I mean, this kind of maybe dovetails on a question further into the session, but I developed a tool that all projects use called the Sustainable Performance Review, and it's an Excel-based tool that we use to track kind of all the different metrics at each phase, and it has a column in there for post-occupancy too, since it's good to double back and say, well, did we actually achieve what we wanted to achieve? And so that tool is set up to kind of check what the goals might be, to evaluate your AIA, your baselines, to evaluate all those kind of performance categories throughout the project. And so we have kind of an internal way of checking those throughout the various design phases.
So Kate, you already kind of talked on kind of how the 2030 commitment kind of affects Lake Plato's culture and how it was kind of brought on. But how, I guess, in saying that, like, you are so data focused in some of these things, how do you kind of discuss this with clients and consultants and get them on board as well?
Yeah, so I guess, going back to internally, one of the things that I do want to add on to is that, like we've mentioned, right, we've been really intuitive moving to more of a science-based approach. And it's interesting, over the past, 10 years, I think, of doing this, we've become a lot more comfortable with metrics and quantitative data. And especially when you're reporting it to 2030 all the time and collectively adding that, it really does allow you to understand lessons learned and how to improve each time. So I think that that's really been affecting our culture and just getting everyone a little more comfortable. And then, of course, the more comfortable all of our design staff is and our architects, it allows us to be a little more confident when we talk to our clients too and our consultants. And so we include our commitment to 2030 goals and design performance right at the beginning. It's in our marketing materials, our proposals, our interviews with potential clients. And so our clients are aware that we're committed to this even before they hire us. And I think a lot of people also just choose to work with our Lake Plato company because of the rigor that we go through for all of our projects. And we try to find people that share the same values. But even for those people that don't necessarily come to us for that high rigor, we're always still encouraging it with our clients and doing it in kind of back of house regardless. So.
Yeah, I guess, like, being in that marketing material, do you ever have a client come to you and say, like, oh, this looks like it's extra, we don't want to do that?
Yeah, I think we do a lot of times. People will come and it won't necessarily be in their scope. And I think that's where we try and say, well, here's maybe, I think similar to the AIA Design Excellence you showed, it's like they have that portion that has the high impact section, or like if you can only do one thing. And so we do try and encourage, maybe you can't go for the full net zero project, but you could at least be zero ready. So I think that there's ways that we still try and include our goals, even if it's not the top best performing option.
Okay, yeah. So here's another question for all participants, and let's go in the reverse order this time. So we'll start with Russell. Kind of what would you say is a key for creating a system to report, and how does that, I guess you already kind of touched on how that process looks, but in terms of reporting to the DDX, how does that process work for your firm?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately it needs to be flexible. as much as possible, and needs to kind of align with the culture that the studio has. And so, you know, that type of process may look different in some of our studios that have, you know, only 20 people versus 300. You know, there are some studios that may only have a couple projects that are really eligible, but others that may have close to 70 in just one office. So what we ended up, because of the we needed to have a size that fit all type of approach, and so we ended up creating more of a centralized process where, you know, each kind of green team leader in our various studios kind of manage however best that process needs to be, in regards to collecting the data, meeting with teams and such. Ultimately, that's my conduit into the various offices around the firm. And then because if you ask 20 people to do the same thing, you may get 20 different answers in the end. We needed to make sure there was a consistency and a rigor to how we reported to the AIA, considering, you know, we, you know, have 200 to 300 projects a year. So to make sure that people are using the same assumptions, the same kind of analysis and such. And so it ended up making most sense for Perkins and Will to basically have me as kind of that centralized node to AIA. And then, you know, we follow, basically I send out reminder emails early, or kind of in the latter half of the design year. So kind of in Q3 and Q4, kind of remind teams about the process. And then we end up collecting everything in February. And then I take, you know, the next 6 weeks or so to collect and collate and bring it all together. And then we use the batch import kind of functionality of DDX, just because to expect individuals to actually make that interface, even at the studio level, could be really challenging and time consuming. So it made sense just to have kind of more of a batch import process being used. And then, you know, we kind of continually monitor how we, you know, what we end up reporting. So we're actually, you know, developing new tools and such to collect different metrics. And so it's not purely about just energy. We need to be collecting other stuff. And so the framework that we've have created, as I mentioned before, our SPR process allows it to be adaptable to kind of the new ways of thinking about sustainability and resilience and inclusion and such. So it's proven to be a pretty good platform, and we're kind of right in that stage of kind of creating a new version of it right now, to still do what AIA is asking for us, but also to bring in a whole level of other metrics that we can be using on all of our projects, both in the design as well as how we talk about our projects, both internally and externally.
All right, Kate, I'll send it over to you for the same question.
Bit of background noise. So as I mentioned before, when we signed on, we were a much smaller firm at that point. And so really it was only Heather, our sustainability at the time director, was managing as just one dedicated staff person to collecting all the data and reporting it back to the DDX. But this became much more challenging once our firm began to grow. So now we're at about 120 people, and similar to, I think when Russell was mentioning kind of having some dedicated people, we adopted what we call our sustainability champions. And so essentially we have one person on each design team who's dedicated to just being that liaison between our design performance team and the design team itself. And so they're the ones that are responsible for tracking sustainability goals and assisting with 2030 reporting. So like Russell was saying, I think we collect a whole list of our projects, and then we start to email each of the sustainability champions, and they're the ones that then enter that data into our kind of in-house platform software, which we then assist with entering into the DDX. So we've got quite a few kind of ways of communication. We also just started this year sustainability champions, or like studio champion, similar to what Russell was saying, where because there's so many different building typologies we do, it really helps to have one person for studio type who can really help understand what is the EUI of that studio, it gets a little more specific. So we have them meeting all together and we brainstorm what tools we might need to help with the DDX this year, what lessons we want to share back to the firm. So we're trying out tons of new things every year. We also do some trainings to those studio champions. So we try to get them to understand exactly what EUI is, the PV tools. We'll do early energy modeling training, just to get ways to make the language a little easier to understand when you go to report. But other than that, I think one of the value of getting more people involved and not just keeping it to one team is that it actually starts to improve the conversation, and it sparks conversation that might not happen otherwise. Because a lot of our teams will be reminded that they actually haven't done an energy model, for example, and maybe that they should, or that they haven't even come up with a baseline EUI. So when firms get so much bigger and it's really hard to keep track of everything, I think having more people involved and being liaisons is a really great way to kind of keep the momentum going and having people ask questions and get involved.
That's really great, Kate, because I think I'm kind of at where Heather was, a few years ago. And it sounds like both of y'all's firms have kind of your own internal tracking system. And I think that would not be cost-effective, time-effective for our firm. So we completely rely on the DDX system to keep track of everything. And then we'll export it and keep a copy, of course, in case. But I think so for us, like I said, at the beginning of the year, we sit down, we look at all the active projects, the projects that were already on DDX, and we go ahead and update those. And then add the new ones and add all the updated information. And it's just maybe me and one other person, and I'd like to start doing that on a quarterly basis, but I've been struggling with how are we gonna figure out who's gonna do that? And is it through studio? Is it per person? Is whoever's doing the internal modeling or the in-house energy modeling? So that to be determined.
Yeah, and so we just signed on last year, so I don't know how the old DDX worked, but it seems like with the new DDX, there's a whole lot more kind of functionality to empower other people within your firm to start to report. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think in trying to figure out.
You could do it before, but now I just looked at it and you can add collaborators. I forget the specific name for them, but you can add people to help. So.
Yeah, so I mean, we're a slight bit bigger than DSGN, but we're kind of looking into using the DDX as kind of a database for tracking all this as well, instead of having an in-house kind of form. So I think we're kind of straddling, and I think everyone's kind of trying to figure out how to kind of empower their project teams to kind of start to report a little bit more. I can see where you want consistency. So once you get to kind of a certain size where someone can't always have an eye on things, that you would want to have that in-house to start to look at kind of making sure everyone's filling things out correctly. But at the size that kind of we're at, I can definitely see where just using the DDX as that tool is probably the most beneficial. And let's see, it's 12:45. I'm gonna go off script for a second and answer one of the questions. So Mark asked, how does your firm use the data you collect from the DDX? Does it inform future designs? And do you include that in your firm's marketing? So let's start with Kate. Do you still have background noise going on?
A little bit, but I think it's going away.
Okay. We'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, so I think that's a really great question. And it's something we've been considering doing more. So what we do every time that we, I guess I didn't mention this, but every time we kind of start reporting again, we do a little presentation to each studio group about, we show our kind of aggregate data of just overall where we were compared to national for every year. So But then in addition, we report back to the studio all their projects and how they compared to other studios. So we are, in a way, at least showing an overview to each of the design staff, just showing like, these are the projects that did really well, and here are the reasons why. One of the things I also wanted to mention is, I guess, part of this has inspired us to do a lot of post-occupancy evaluations. So we're now putting a lot of energy monitors on our building to actually measure not only what's the predicted energy use, but what energy are we actually using, so that we can do reports with that information as well, and report that back to the team on lessons learned. So it's definitely something we are actively trying to get into more and more each year.
Beth, how about y'all?
So this is funny. So I actually do like 2 lunch and learns. One usually right after we finish submitting the report, and just kind of here's where we're at. And then I wait for the AIA 2030 commitment report, that the one that you showed. I wait for those to come out, which is usually around the summer. And then I like to do it again and just say kind of, here's where we're at, and here's where the country's at, or where we are as a AIA. And that's, even that alone, I think, inspires people to keep going and trying to work towards the goal a little bit more. And how can, you know, spurs conversation, like how can we do in-house modeling, which we just started doing, and how can we track, because somebody asked the question, is anybody tracking this, you know, the energy bills on this? Oh, well, no, but I can call the city and get a copy of the energy bills. You know, it's not that hard. So we'll start doing those things.
Yeah, I think we're kind of in the same boat as well, where we're starting to ask clients for their energy bills to know how our projects are performing. Russell, I guess this is more, how do you collect with the in-house, and how does that inform your future designs and for marketing?
Yeah, I mean, because we really don't rely as much on the DDX as, you know, like Beth had mentioned. But, you know, once I collect all the information for all of our projects, I do end up kind of creating a report card, if you will, and then report out to our kind of our firm-wide sustainability group. And so it looks at both energy and water and material health and resilience and a lot of other categories at the kind of firm-wide, market sector, studio levels. And so we can start to see, you know, how did we do this year versus last year versus the year before that? So we can start to see trends. And then also we start to aggregate all that data together so that people can use it to see, well, what kind of EUI are we designing in our particular studios for these types of buildings during this type of year. So by collecting all this data, we have, you know, years and years of benchmarking opportunity to use internally. And then we also expect, you know, any type of like design review and other kind of process milestone for all of our projects to be reporting out all that information. So we're not just looking at pretty pictures, we're also looking at metrics at the same time, because they're all the same. So yeah, I mean, we kind of have to do our own approach towards kind of reporting out. Essentially, when I do put together that report card, then all the other kind of studio leaders can then report out to their studio and kind of take that information and tailor it to whatever format is necessary, depending upon the robustness of their green team or what type of information they were looking for.
So Beth, one thing that we're also kind of working through on this is kind of how we get that PEUI data. Like we're just starting to kind of look into really doing in-house energy modeling, architect-led energy modeling, so not full building. But for the most part, we're just using the baseline code compliant numbers. So that also helps with decreasing the amount of time that actually takes to put projects into the DDX. But how does your firm kind of handle that?
Well, it's a little bit of a mix. I mean, I would say we usually do rely on the DDX to help us get the predicted EUI numbers and using basically whatever codes are applicable for that project. But we have had like a few city projects lately that are, we do energy modeling with the MEP on. So I will work with the MEP engineer to review their energy models and to make sure that the envelope is correct and the glazing is correct and generally, you know, it's the right type of mechanical system. And we'll go back and forth. They used to charge us like every time they ran an energy model, but I found MEP engineers that don't do that. And so now we can kind of go more back and forth. So that's what we've been doing lately. And so about last year, about 50% of our projects is as far as gross square footage or model. And recently just got Sapphira through SketchUp Pro, and it wasn't that much more. And so we're just now starting to do in-house energy modeling. So 2021, this year will be our first time to report in-house modeling.
Okay. And just so like everyone who's listening knows that you don't have to do energy modeling to report to 2030, that you can use code compliant kind of numbers that the DDX will autofill for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, and I forgot to say, like, a lot of people think maybe that was one of your myths. They think you have to fill out every single blank, and they have to you fill out as much as you can. It's okay to leave things blank.
Josh, I'd also add on, you know, one of the, not every project can do a full energy model. And if you go kind of the code compliant path, you'll never be able to achieve the 2030 challenge. There's no code out there that really gets close to even 70%. There's still a pretty big gap between even the most progressive energy code and the 70% reduction. So like kind of, if you have energy models from past projects, looking at those and seeing, well, what were the kind of MEP strategies done, and then at least giving that information to other projects. And so instead of talking about the energy reduction from the 2030 baseline, kind of tailoring it to, well, how could you at least be 10 to 15% better than this particular code? And so it starts to make it a little more current. I know one of the biggest issues we've had is, you know, the 2030 baseline. There are people that feel it's like completely irrelevant. They're like, why are we evaluating buildings that were designed under like ASHRAE 1989? Essentially, is kind of what the equivalent might be. And have a hard time like reconnecting to current codes. So looking back at energy models and seeing what were the strategies, and then trying to replicate those, or at least use those as a baseline for other projects that might not have an energy model, you know, scope, at least gets those projects further ahead. And maybe you could start to estimate, you know, based on past strategies and past projects, you know, if you use this type of, you know, dedicated outside air system or something, did that contribute to about, you know, 10% better than code or something? So there's some data mining that could be used, even if you don't have kind of an energy modeling kind of scope on your projects, to at least get all those other projects further ahead than they might have been.
Running a little short on time now, but I'll see if I can get through the next couple questions. So instead of just kind of focusing on like reporting, Kate, Lake Plato probably, of the kind of panelist here, probably does the most projects by number in our kind of climate zone. So do you have like one or two key strategies for kind of getting EUI down in these climate zones?
Yeah, sure. Maybe also just going back to the other question about energy modeling too, because I think this ties in, is that regardless of kind of what climate zone you're in, I think we've noticed that we've been trying out Insight with Autodesk, which is a free early energy modeling tool. It doesn't do code compliance, but it's been a really great way for us to visualize the key strategies and passive strategies that we use intuitively. But we've noticed that even the projects that have started to use that are reducing their EUI by about 15% just by going through the effort and realizing that there's little key strategies that you can use just within that software. So I guess to start, you know, that's one of the ways that we've been measuring our strategies that we use. But Some of the kind of optimal strategies we found are not just dependent on climate, but also program and occupancy. But we always try and use passive strategies first that really work well with the natural environment that we're in the climate zone. And so, we've noticed that especially where we are, providing shade is probably the top strategy, not just for energy performance, but thermal comfort and daylighting as well, because you can really just reduce energy loads through appropriate shading, but also reducing your glazing too, and really focusing on specific, heating loads of the day, whether that's the southwest corner. Orientation is all really important. And what's exciting about that insight tool is it allows you to do that stuff. So you can look at how your shading device lengths impact energy, the window to wall ratio, the orientation. So a lot of those tools allow you to analyze your passive strategies and see how well they actually work. I'd also say that along with a well-shaded and oriented building, that also allows you to really take advantage of prevailing breezes and natural ventilation, which is another thing that we're really trying to work on to just understand thermal comfort, along with working on set points. So if you can really convince your client to adjust set points so that they're not cooling their building a tremendous amount and we're giving them natural breezes and shading appropriately, there's a lot of those strategies that I think work quite well in our climate zone.
Okay. So I will kind of let any questions from the audience kind of come in, but while there might be someone typing, let's kind of get some closing thoughts or kind of words of advice, how you might be able to kind of talk to clients. Any of those three from y'all. So that's Beth, if you'd like to start.
Closing thoughts.
Yeah.
Or how do we talk to clients?
Let's do clients, because I feel like that's probably going to be, someone's going to want to know about that more than just closing thoughts.
I think that's tricky. It depends on the client. And I mean, some of our clients know that we care about sustainable design, and that that's something our firm sort of focuses on, like in a holistic manner. We as a firm culture, we don't think that there's like sustainable projects and non-sustainable projects. All projects should be working towards the same goals. Some of our clients get that, and they will ask us to go, even if they don't want to do a third-party certification, they'll ask us to look into it a little bit more and to talk about that. I think some of our clients just don't care, and so we do it behind the scenes, so that's okay.
So I don't see any questions coming in. So Kate, do you have any kind of words of advice?
Yeah, I think this is something we've been talking about in our, like, even as we're redoing our sustainability action plan too, and trying to, I think, really just hone in the kind of triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit, and that, there's always something for everyone in this mission. Even if you're not just doing it solely for the planet, it all affects you in the end. The climate is changing, and we do have to not only protect the planet, but we're protecting ourselves from future impacts, trying to be resilient. And I think there's that also third part of profitability, where, there is really, we've just seen the payback of this stuff is that by being resilient and trying to reduce our EUI, there is profitability in that as well. So I think we're always trying to tie in all three of those things together when trying to convince our clients that we really do want to be striving for these goals the best we can.
Okay. And, Russell, any famous last words of this session?
Sure. Well, I guess in regards to the process, just don't get discouraged. It's a journey, everyone, and you just got to test things out and see what works in the end in terms of, how this process works internally to your studios. But in terms of clients, yeah, I think what Kate mentioned is exactly kind of how we approach things as well. You know, every client has different drivers. Every client uses a kind of a different language. And so figuring out what that language is, whether is it through operational efficiency? So they're talking about bottom line, they want to save dollars. Is it about environmental issues? Is it even health? You can associate, you know, if you're reducing energy consumption, that's less emissions that are being put into the air, which causes asthma. And so there are ways to connect these disparate larger topics to building energy efficiency in the end. But just figuring out what that is and make that the gateway into everything else that we want to do, both visibly and behind the scenes. That's how we've gotten more clients to be more engaged. And because you're not going to find very many clients that are going to say, sure, I'm very interested in this AIA 2030 commitment. They have no idea what it's all about. And so getting to the root of what makes them tick and what makes them motivated is the way to get to that end goal.
Yeah. And I think
anecdotally, when I've tried to talk to clients about the health, like they seem to get it. They really care. We all care about our own health, and so I think it makes sense. And we start talking about materials and the red list. You know, I might have to explain that, but as soon as I do, they're like, "Oh, okay, I got it."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a super hot topic right now, and yeah, might as well use that energy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just in kind of terms of starting for anyone who hasn't signed on yet, who's listening, I think one of the biggest benefits is one, just kind of seeing where your projects are, and also like in doing that, you're starting to kind of think about these things. So part of our process has been to kind of start to fill out kind of goals based on the framework for design excellence, and just in starting to think about that has had a big impact on kind of how we think about designing the buildings that we do. So for the next session, it's going to be on sustainability action plans. If you go to the DDX website, it's the 2030ddx.aia.org, and click on the little question mark in the upper right-hand corner. And from this page, you can also create your account. It's different from your AIA account, but you can use the same login information if you want. But if you go to that check mark and then over to the page tree, there's a couple of resources here and pull downs. So if you click on 2030 Essentials and Sustainability Action Plans, you can find this link to examples if you're kind of curious about what we'll be discussing. And then we're going to have two great speakers, one on kind of the process of creating a sustainability action plan, and then a second on kind of getting more into the goal setting and setting aggressive and achievable targets. So we'll see you on February 11th, I believe. Yeah, February 11th at noon. And that announcement will go out next week for everyone to kind of RSVP. And well, yes, we will send out an email with some resources as well. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, how do I shut this off?
You can just end it, Josh.
Okay.